The concert hall was full that evening. Every seat was taken and the air was buzzing with excitement. Families, teachers, and students were talking in low voices, holding programs and whispering about who might win this year's grand piano competition. It was one of those events that drew talented young people from everywhere, all eager to prove themselves in front of judges who were known to be very strict. The lights above the stage were bright, almost too bright. A shiny black grand piano sat at the center of the wooden stage, its surface reflecting the glow. The judges were already seated in the front row, with their score sheets and pens ready. Everything looked polished and professional. One after another, performers came out and played. Some were confident, dressed in expensive clothes, moving with grace and pride. The audience clapped politely after each performance, sometimes with real excitement, sometimes just out of habit. It was a long evening and people were getting a little restless. Then came a pause. The announcer stepped up to the microphone and called the next participant's name. The hall grew quiet again as a young woman slowly walked toward the stage. At first glance, she didn't look like someone who belonged there. Her clothes were simple, not what people expected at such a grand event. Her shoes were worn and her hair was tied back in a plain way. She carried herself carefully as if afraid to draw too much attention. A few whispers started in the crowd. Some people exchanged small, knowing smiles. Someone at the back even chuckled. It was the kind of laughter that comes from judging too quickly. The young woman heard it, though she tried not to show it. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked across the stage. The judges looked up from their papers. One of them adjusted his glasses, giving her a quick, uncertain look. Another judge sighed softly, as if already expecting disappointment. The announcer introduced her in a flat tone, and then there was silence again. She sat down on the piano bench, looked at the keys, and took a slow, deep breath. For a long moment, she didn't play. The audience waited. A few people looked at their watches. The young woman closed her eyes, pressing her lips together. Her fingers hovered above the keys, then dropped gently to touch the piano. The first note came out soft and unsure. It wasn't perfect. In fact, the first few bars were uneven. A wrong note slipped in. Someone in the crowd muttered under their breath. A couple of young contestants sitting near the aisle exchanged small laughs, trying to hide it behind their hands. The sound reached the stage, faint but sharp. The young woman's shoulders tightened. She paused, took another breath, and started again. The second time, her hands found a better rhythm. The melody began to take shape. It was a simple tune, not the flashy kind that shows off speed or fancy skill. It was quiet, almost like a whisper. Slowly, something changed. The more she played, the steadier she became. Her fingers moved with a natural flow, not rushed, not forced. Her back straightened. Her eyes stayed closed, lost somewhere deep inside the music. The crowd, which had been whispering and waiting to be unimpressed, began to quiet down. The hall that once echoed with low laughter now fell still. There was something different about the way she played. Her notes weren't just sounds. They carried a kind of feeling that was hard to describe. It wasn't about showing off, it was about speaking without words. Every note seemed to tell a story that no one in the room had heard before, but everyone could somehow feel. As she played, her mind wandered far from the stage. She wasn't seeing the piano anymore. She was seeing a small, sunlit room with thin curtains and an old upright piano that her mother used to play. The sound of her mother's laughter filled her memory. She remembered small hands, her own, pressing the wrong keys as her mother gently corrected her. "Try again," her mother would say, smiling. "Let the piano breathe." Those were happier days, the kind that passed too quickly. When her mother got sick, the music stopped in their home. The piano was covered with a cloth and dust began to settle on it. For years, she couldn't bring herself to touch the keys. Every time she tried, it reminded her of the person she had lost. But deep inside, she knew her mother would never have wanted her to stop. That's why she entered this competition. It wasn't about winning. It was about facing her fears, standing on a stage her mother once dreamed she'd stand on and letting the music speak again. This time, for both of them. Back in the present, her fingers moved faster now. The quiet melody turned into something more alive, more emotional. The audience began to lean forward without even realizing it. There was power in the softness of her sound, something pure and deeply personal. Even the judges, who had been skeptical at first, now looked up. One of them put his pen down. Another whispered something to his neighbor, but didn't take his eyes off her. She wasn't just playing anymore. She was opening her heart in front of everyone. The audience could feel the shift. They could sense that this wasn't about technique, it was about truth. It was raw emotion turned into sound, the kind of feeling that doesn't need explanation, because everyone in their own way has felt loss, hope, and love. The room stayed still. The laughter was long gone. No one even dared to cough. Each note echoed softly, fading into silence before the next one came. The young woman's hands began to tremble slightly again, but this time not from fear. It was from emotion. She could feel tears in her eyes, though she kept playing. Her breathing grew uneven. She could almost hear her mother's voice in her head telling her, "Don't stop now." The piece built up slowly, like a storm gathering strength. Her fingers moved faster, the melody rising higher, carrying both sadness and beauty together. The sound filled the hall completely, wrapping everyone in it. When she finally struck the last chord, it rang out clearly and hung in the air for a long second. Then silence followed, a deep, heavy silence. She kept her head down, her hands still on the piano. She didn't dare look up. For that one quiet moment, time seemed to stop. The hall, which had once been full of whispers and judgment, was now full of something entirely different: respect, awe, an emotion that no one could quite describe. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and folded them in her lap. Her eyes were wet, but she smiled faintly to herself. She knew she had done what she came to do. She hadn't just played the piano. She had told her story, and her mother's too. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap yet. It was as if they were afraid to break the spell the music had created. Then finally someone started to applaud, softly at first, then louder. It spread from one person to another until the entire hall was filled with sound again. This time not of mockery, but admiration. She looked up, surprised. People were standing now, clapping with genuine emotion. Even the ones who had laughed earlier were joining in, their faces red with shame. She bowed slightly, not with pride, but with gratitude. The bright stage lights reflected in her eyes as she whispered softly, "Thank you." And even though she didn't say it out loud, in her heart she whispered another thank you to her mother, the one who had taught her not to give up and to always let the music speak when words failed. As she walked off the stage, the applause followed her, echoing long after she disappeared behind the curtain. It was no longer the sound of judgment, but the sound of hearts moved by something real. No one in that audience would forget her that night, not because of how she looked when she entered, but because of how she made them feel when she played. The applause that night still echoed in her mind long after she left the stage. Backstage, she sat alone for a while, her heart still racing. The sound of her heartbeat mixed with the faint music from the next performer. She was shaking, but not from fear anymore. This time it was relief. For the first time in years, she had played not to impress anyone, but to free something that had been locked inside her for too long. She looked down at her hands. They still trembled a little, the fingers sore from the intensity of her performance. Those same hands had once been too scared to touch a piano again. Now they had spoken to hundreds of people without saying a single word. As she waited for the results, she didn't really care about winning. Deep inside, she already felt she had gained something much bigger than a trophy, but still her heart jumped every time someone called a name. She listened carefully when the top 3 contestants were announced. Her name wasn't called. There was no disappointment, though. She just smiled softly, clapped for the winners, and quietly left the backstage area. Outside the concert hall, the night air was cool. She wrapped her coat tighter around her and walked toward the bus stop. The streets were empty except for a few lights shining through the fog. For the first time in years, she felt calm. She didn't even notice the tears that slid down her cheeks as she walked. They weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of peace. The next morning, something unexpected happened. The performance had been recorded by one of the event organizers and uploaded online. It wasn't meant to be special, just part of the competition's collection. But somehow, overnight, people began to share it. The first few comments were simple. Beautiful piece. She played with her heart. Then more and more people joined in. Someone wrote, "I don't know who she is, but this touched my soul." Another said, "The moment she began, I could feel her pain and hope through every note." By the end of the day, the video had thousands of views. By the end of the week, it had millions. The world had fallen silent for her music the same way the hall had that night. People from different countries wrote in different languages, all saying the same thing, that her playing had made them cry. Meanwhile, she had no idea any of this was happening. She still lived her quiet life, working in a small bookstore and teaching piano to children in the evenings. She didn't check social media often. Her phone was old, her internet slow. When one of her students ran in one day shouting, "You're famous," she just laughed, thinking it was a joke. But when the child showed her the video on a tablet, her smile faded. She watched herself on the screen. The same nervous walk, the same trembling hands, the same first shaky notes. The camera caught everything. It even caught the small tear that slipped down her cheek at the end. She felt strange watching it. It didn't even feel like her anymore. It felt like watching a version of herself she had finally let go of. Still, the kind comments moved her deeply. People were sharing her story, not because of how she looked, not because of how perfect she was, but because of how real the music felt. That evening, she went home and sat at her old piano. It wasn't fancy like the one in the concert hall. It was slightly out of tune and one key stuck a little when pressed. But it was hers. She ran her fingers across the keys and whispered, "We're not done yet, are we?" And then she began to play again. The more she played, the more she remembered. She thought of her mother, how she would hum softly beside her, tapping the rhythm on the edge of the piano with her fingers. She thought of the way her mother would tell her that music wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. "If you're honest with your heart, the piano will understand," her mother used to say. For years, she had forgotten that lesson. She used to think she wasn't good enough, that talent had to shine like gold to matter. But now she understood something deeper, that sometimes the most broken hearts make the most beautiful sounds. A few days later, she received a letter in the mail. It was from one of the judges from the competition. The letter was short but full of warmth. He wrote, "Your music reminded me why I fell in love with the piano years ago. You didn't just perform, you told the truth." He invited her to play at a charity concert the following month. At first, she hesitated. The thought of standing on stage again made her nervous. But something inside her whispered that this was meant to happen. Maybe this was her mother's way of guiding her once more. So she agreed. The concert was smaller, more intimate. It wasn't a competition, just a gathering of people who loved music. When she arrived, some of the organizers recognized her from the viral video. They greeted her warmly, and for the first time, she didn't feel out of place. As she stepped onto the stage again, she took a moment to look around. This time there were no whispers, no laughter, no doubt in anyone's eyes. Only quiet anticipation. She smiled softly and began to play. The melody she chose was one she had written herself, a piece she had started years ago but never finished. It began softly, like a conversation between two people who had been apart for too long. The notes flowed gently, carrying both sadness and hope. She played as if her heart was guiding her hands, each chord saying what words could never express. When she finished, the audience didn't clap right away. Just like before, there was silence, gentle, peaceful silence. And then the applause came, warm and full of love. After the concert, people came up to her, some with tears in their eyes, telling her how much the music meant to them. An elderly man told her it reminded him of his late wife. A young woman said it helped her forgive someone she hadn't spoken to in years. She listened quietly, smiling, realizing that the gift her mother had given her was now touching lives far beyond what she could have imagined. When she went home that night, she sat by her window and looked up at the sky. The city was quiet, and somewhere in the distance she could hear faint piano notes from a nearby apartment. She smiled, thinking maybe someone else was inspired to play again because of her. She thought about how strange life was, that a girl who had once been laughed at on stage now had the power to move people to tears. But she didn't let the fame get to her. She didn't care about views or numbers. What mattered to her was that her mother's dream was alive again, carried through every note she played. As weeks went by, invitations started coming from different places. Schools, music groups, and even small theaters wanted her to perform. But she only accepted the ones that felt meaningful. She wanted every performance to be honest, not just a show. In one of those events, after her performance, a little boy came up to her and said shyly, "I want to play like you one day." She smiled, knelt down and told him gently, "Play with your heart, not your hands. The rest will follow." Those simple words were the same her mother had once told her. Passing them on felt like completing a circle, like giving back what she had once received. Her journey wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It wasn't about competition or perfection. It was about connection, between her mother's memory, and the hearts of the people who listened. Every time she sat at a piano now, she didn't think of it as a stage. She thought of it as a conversation with the world, a way of saying, I understand your pain, your joy, your silence. And that understanding was what made her music powerful. As the days went on, she began to write new pieces, songs inspired by the stories people told her after her performances. One was about love that never got a goodbye, another about a father's sacrifice. Each one carried a little piece of someone else's truth. Through her music, she learned that everyone carries a story inside them. Some happy, some painful, but when shared they bring people closer, and so, the girl who once walked onto a stage full of laughter had now become a voice for many hearts that couldn't speak for themselves. Her music wasn't just a performance anymore. It had become a bridge between souls. The days after the charity concert brought a calm she hadn't felt in years. Each morning, sunlight filled her small apartment, landing on the old piano near the window. The same piano that had once gathered dust was now alive again. Its surface had scratches, the keys were yellowed with age, but to her it was perfect. Every sound it made carried a memory. She would sit at it every evening after work, not to practice, but to talk through her music. It had become her way of thinking, of remembering, and sometimes of healing. When she played, she didn't feel lonely. She felt like someone was there with her, not in body but in spirit. One evening, as she played softly, her thoughts wandered back to her mother. The music faded, and she rested her hands on the keys, staring blankly at the wall. The sound of her mother's laughter echoed in her mind, warm and familiar. She could still remember how her mother would hum while cooking, the same little tune she used to play on the piano afterward. Her mother had been her first teacher, her greatest supporter and her best friend. They didn't have much money, but they had each other. Her mother worked long hours at a small shop, but every night, no matter how tired she was, she'd sit beside her daughter and listen to her play. Music doesn't need a rich room, she used to say with a smile. It just needs a rich heart. When her mother got sick, everything changed. The piano went silent. The house felt emptier every day. The laughter that once filled their small home was replaced by the sound of medicine bottles and quiet sighs. She was still young then. Too young to understand why life had turned so hard. Too young to believe that something so bright could fade so quickly. She remembered the last night clearly. Her mother was lying in bed, weak but smiling. She had asked her to play one last song. Something gentle, she had whispered. With shaking hands, the girl had played her mother's favorite melody, the same tune she had once learned sitting on her lap. Halfway through the song, she looked up. Her mother's eyes were closed, her breathing slow but peaceful. That was the last time she ever played. The piano stayed untouched after that night. She pushed the memory away, blinking quickly as her vision blurred. Even after all these years, the pain hadn't completely faded. But now, instead of running from it, she used it. Every time she sat at the piano, she poured that ache into her music, turning her memories into melodies. The world had changed since her video went viral. People started writing to her from places she had never even heard of. Some shared stories of losing someone they loved. Others thanked her for reminding them of hope. Reading those messages made her realize that pain wasn't something to hide from. It was something everyone carried in their own way. One evening, she was invited to perform at a small music festival in another city. It wasn't a competition, just a gathering of artists. She accepted quietly, thinking it would be a chance to play without pressure, just to share her heart again. When she arrived at the venue, she was greeted by a kind organizer who recognized her from the video. "You have no idea how many people came just to hear you," he said warmly. That made her nervous, but also grateful. She wasn't used to being seen as someone special. She was still the same quiet woman who once sat in the back of classrooms, who once doubted her worth. As she walked through the backstage area, she could hear the other performers talking. Their laughter reminded her of that first competition night. The whispers, the judgment, the fear. But this time she felt different. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She was there simply to play. When her turn came, she stepped onto the stage. The hall wasn't huge, but it was full. The lights weren't blinding like before. They were warm and gentle. She could see faces clearly. People of all ages waiting, expectant but kind. She sat down, placed her hands on the piano, and took a deep breath. For a moment she said a silent prayer, not for success but for honesty. Then she began. The first few notes were soft and slow. The melody carried a weight, something tender yet heavy. It wasn't a happy song, but it wasn't sad either. It was somewhere in between. The kind of sound that reminds people of something they've lost but still hold close. As she played, she thought of her mother again, of those nights when they shared laughter and stories, when dreams still felt possible. She thought of how her mother had sacrificed so much just to buy that old piano. She remembered the times when the electricity would go out, and they'd light a candle, and she'd still keep playing in the dim glow. Each memory added another layer to her music. Her fingers moved naturally, like they knew what to say before her mind could think it. She could almost feel her mother sitting beside her again, humming softly to the tune. Halfway through, she looked up briefly and saw tears on some faces in the crowd. The sight filled her heart, not with pride but with connection. They weren't crying because of her skill. They were crying because they felt what she felt. That was the true magic of music. When she finished, the last note lingered in the air for a long moment. Then came the applause. Gentle at first, then stronger until the whole hall was clapping. She bowed slightly, smiling through misty eyes. After the concert, several people came up to her. One woman, older and frail, took her hand and said, "Your music brought back my husband's memory. I haven't cried in years, but tonight, I felt him again." The woman's voice trembled, and so did hers when she replied softly, "That means more to me than you'll ever know." Another person, a young man, told her that he had given up playing music after his father passed away. But her performance reminded him why he started in the first place. He promised he would go home and play again. She listened to each story with a full heart. That night, as she packed up, she realized that her mother's gift had become something much larger than herself. It was touching strangers, helping them find healing in their own pain. On the train ride home, she sat by the window, watching the dark fields rush by. The rhythm of the train almost sounded like a song. She rested her head against the glass and closed her eyes, feeling grateful. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who had been laughed at on that stage, too scared to believe in herself. If that girl could see her now, she would probably cry, but she'd also smile. Because this was proof that even the smallest beginnings can turn into something beautiful when you stay true to your heart. In the following weeks, she kept writing new pieces. Each one told a part of her story. Some were inspired by her mother, others by the people she met after her concerts. She called one of them The Light Returns. It was about finding peace after pain, hope after silence. Whenever she played that song, she felt her mother close, not as a memory but as presence. She could almost hear her whispering, "See, the music never left you." And she finally understood what her mother meant all those years ago. That real music doesn't come from practice or fame, but from the courage to let your heart speak. She wasn't trying to be known anymore. She just wanted to keep sharing that voice, the one that belonged not only to her but to everyone who had ever felt lost, broken, or forgotten. Her journey had started with laughter from an audience that doubted her. Now it was carried by tears from those who understood her. That transformation wasn't something she had planned. It had simply happened because she stayed honest, because she played for something real. The pain behind her music would always be there, but now it was no longer heavy. It had turned into something beautiful, something that reached beyond her, reminding everyone that sometimes the deepest scars create the most meaningful songs. And every night, before going to bed, she would look at her piano, touch its keys gently and whisper, "Thank you for helping me speak again." Life began to move differently after that festival. Each day brought new letters, new invitations, and new faces who wanted to meet the woman behind the piano that made the world pause. But she still lived her life quietly, in the same small apartment with the same old piano sitting near the window. She didn't want fame. She just wanted to play. Her mornings were still simple. She'd make tea, water the small plant by the window, and walk to her teaching job. Her students were children from the neighborhood, some shy, some full of energy, but all eager to learn. They didn't know much about her growing popularity online. To them, she was just their kind teacher who always said, "Don't rush the music. Let it breathe." Every time a student played a wrong note and looked up nervously, she would smile and say softly, "Mistakes are just small pauses before you find the right sound." It was what her mother once told her, and now she passed it on to them. In the evenings, when the city got quiet, she would sit at her piano and write. The notes came to her like memories, soft, unhurried, and full of life. Sometimes she played late into the night without realizing how much time had passed. The sound would float out the open window, and neighbors walking by would stop for a moment just to listen. One of those nights, she received an email from a well-known orchestra director. He had seen her video and wanted her to perform with them at a charity gala in the capital city. It would be a big event with hundreds of people attending, including musicians she had admired for years. She hesitated before replying. The idea of standing on another grand stage made her heart race, but there was something inside her that whispered, "You're ready now." Weeks passed as she prepared. She practiced the same piece she played in that first competition, the one that had once made people laugh before it made them cry. But this time it wasn't about proving anything. She wanted to play it again to show how far she'd come, how music could turn pain into peace. When the day of the performance arrived, the city was glowing with lights. The concert hall was enormous, filled with people in elegant clothes. She stood backstage holding her hands together, trying to calm her breathing. She could hear the soft murmur of the crowd through the curtains. The sound of the orchestra warming up echoed faintly, filling the air with tension and excitement. When her name was announced, she stepped out slowly. The lights were bright again, but she didn't flinch this time. Her heart was calm, her step steady. The same piano that had once felt like a mountain to climb now felt like an old friend waiting for her. She bowed slightly and sat down. The audience went silent. Then she began to play. The first note rang out soft and clear. It was the same melody she had played years ago, but it didn't sound the same anymore. The rhythm had changed. There was confidence in her fingers now, warmth in her touch. Each note was alive, carrying not sorrow but strength. The music flowed through the hall like water, washing over the audience in waves. Her hands moved with grace, her eyes half closed. The orchestra joined in softly behind her, their instruments weaving around her melody, lifting it higher. This wasn't the sound of someone trying to be heard. This was the sound of someone who had already been found. As she played, she remembered all the moments that had brought her here. The laughter that once hurt, the nights of doubt, the quiet conversations with her mother in her memories. She realized that every hardship had led to this moment. Every tear had shaped her sound. Her fingers moved faster now, rising with emotion. The orchestra swelled behind her, filling the hall with sound so powerful that people leaned forward, their hearts caught between joy and sadness. She ended the piece with a single soft note that lingered in the air before fading into silence. The pause afterward felt endless. No one dared to move. And then, like a wave breaking, the applause began. People stood, clapping and cheering. Some had tears in their eyes. The conductor walked over, shook her hand, and whispered something only she could hear. "You didn't just play music tonight. You told every person here a story." She bowed again, her heart full. She didn't need to say anything. The piano had said it all. After the concert, people came up to her, asking questions, sharing feelings. A woman in a blue dress told her that the music reminded her of her childhood. A young man said it gave him courage to start playing again after years of silence. Someone else simply said, "Thank you for making us feel alive tonight." When the hall finally emptied, she stayed behind for a while. The lights had dimmed and the silence felt peaceful. She walked up to the piano and touched its keys one last time, smiling softly. "We did it," she whispered. That night, as she returned to her hotel room, she sat by the window and looked at the city lights below. Her heart was quiet, but her thoughts were loud. She thought of how different her life had become, not in fame or wealth, but in meaning. Her music now belonged to people. It wasn't just hers anymore. The next morning she woke up early and walked through the city streets. People smiled at her as she passed by, some recognizing her from the night before. A few stopped her to say thank you. One elderly man held her hand and said, "You reminded me of my late wife. I could see her smiling while you played." She smiled back, holding his hand gently, and said, then maybe she was listening too. Her heart was full of quiet joy. She realized then that music had given her something even her mother would have been proud of, the power to bring comfort to others. When she returned home, she placed a single white flower on her mother's old photograph by the piano. She sat down and played the same melody once more, but this time, she added a new ending, one that sounded like a soft goodbye and a thank you at the same time. The notes floated through the air, wrapping around the room like a warm embrace. It felt as though her mother was sitting beside her again, smiling, her eyes full of pride. As the final note faded, she whispered quietly, "I made it, Mama. We made it." After that night, she began receiving invitations from around the world to perform, to speak, to teach. She accepted a few, always choosing the ones that felt right. No matter how far she traveled, she never forgot the girl who once stood trembling on a stage, mocked for daring to dream. That memory kept her humble. It reminded her of how music had saved her life. Everywhere she went, she shared that same message. That music isn't about applause or perfection. It's about honesty, about feeling something real. Don't chase sound, she often told her students, chase truth. Her story began to inspire others beyond music too. People wrote about her in magazines and newspapers, calling her the woman who healed hearts through piano. But she never called herself that. She was just someone who had learned to turn pain into melody, silence into song. Late one night, after returning from a long trip, she sat by her piano again. The city outside was quiet. She closed her eyes and began to play a new tune, soft, delicate, and full of peace. It was the sound of gratitude, of acceptance. For the first time, she wasn't playing for anyone else. She wasn't thinking about her past or her future. She was just there in that moment with her music, and as she played, she felt a sense of lightness she had never known before. The girl who once trembled had transformed into a woman who spoke through sound. Her journey had come full circle, not in fame or awards, but in peace. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet night, as her hands danced gently across the keys, she felt it again, that invisible touch, that quiet warmth that reminded her she was never truly alone. Her mother had been right all along. Music, when played with love, never really ends. It stays echoing in every heart it touches. The months that followed were quiet but full. She no longer needed to chase stages or attention. The music world had already found her, but more importantly, she had found herself. Her home became a small place of peace, walls filled with framed photographs, postcards from places she'd played, and little notes from students she had taught along the way. Every morning, she still brewed the same tea and opened the window to let in the city air. Her piano stood by the window, polished but aged, with its keys worn smooth from years of practice. People often imagined her life to be full of excitement, big events, flashing lights, interviews, but she preferred the quiet days. She still taught lessons to children from her neighborhood. She still smiled when one of them made a mistake and whispered, "Try again, slower this time." Her students didn't care that she was famous now. They came for her warmth, not her name. Some of them came from families who couldn't afford proper lessons, but she never turned anyone away. "Music doesn't belong to the rich," she once said. "It belongs to everyone with a heartbeat." In the evenings, when the sun dipped low, she would play softly to herself. Sometimes she played her old pieces. Sometimes she created new ones, quiet, wordless melodies that sounded like conversations with the past. One night, as she finished a lesson, a man from a music organization visited her. He said they wanted to record a documentary about her journey, from the day she was mocked to the night she moved an entire audience to tears. She smiled politely and listened as he explained how inspiring her story was. "I'm not sure," she said after a long pause. "People already heard the music. They don't need to see my face to remember the sound." But he insisted, "You could inspire so many others who've been laughed at or doubted. They need to know what you went through." That made her think. She remembered the younger version of herself, the girl who had once walked onto a stage shaking, hearing people whisper behind her back. Maybe if that girl had seen a story like hers, she wouldn't have felt so alone. So she agreed. A small film crew came to her home a week later. They were gentle and respectful, filming her teaching, cooking, walking through the market, and playing her piano by the window. They asked questions about her life, about fear, failure, and hope. She answered softly, never exaggerating, never pretending to be something she wasn't. "I didn't plan to become anyone special," she said during one interview. "I just didn't give up. When they laughed, I kept playing. That's all." When the documentary aired, it touched millions of people. Letters poured in again, not just from musicians, but from people who had struggled in completely different ways. A mother wrote that her son with autism smiled for the first time while watching her play. A soldier wrote that her music made him cry after years of feeling nothing. A young woman wrote that she finally had the courage to perform in public. Reading those words made her cry quietly. She placed all those letters in a wooden box near her piano. Whenever she felt tired, she opened it and read a few. They reminded her why she played. As time went on, she started visiting schools, hospitals, and shelters, not as a celebrity, but simply as someone who understood pain. She carried a small keyboard with her, playing for children who had never seen a real piano before. Sometimes they clapped in rhythm, sometimes they sang along. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was alive. One afternoon, she visited a children's hospital. The small room was filled with beds and the soft hum of machines. She sat by one child's bedside and began to play. The boy had been silent for days, his eyes half open, but when she started, a small smile appeared on his face. His mother's eyes filled with tears. That was the day she realized something powerful, that music could heal places even words couldn't reach. After that, she made it her mission. She began organizing free concerts in small towns and community centers. People came not dressed in fine clothes, but in ordinary outfits, bringing their children, their parents, their tired hearts. She played for them the same way she played for large stages, with full heart and open hands. And every time the last note faded, people would sit still, not wanting it to end. Some wiped their eyes. Some hugged each other. She saw herself in them, the lost, the hopeful, the broken trying to become whole again. One night, after one of those small concerts, she was packing up when a young man approached her. He looked nervous, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "I came here because of you," he said quietly. "I used to be scared to show anyone my music. But when I saw your video, I thought, maybe it's okay to be different." She looked at him and smiled softly. "It's more than okay," she said. "That's where the beauty begins." He handed her the paper, a short poem he had written, and thanked her before leaving. Later that night, she read it by her lamp. The last line said, "Some hearts speak through sound, others just need someone to listen." She folded it gently and placed it inside her box of letters. Seasons passed. The city changed, her students grew up, and her name slowly became part of music history. Yet she stayed the same, humble, calm, and deeply grateful. Sometimes she missed her mother deeply. On those days, she didn't talk much. She would light a candle, sit beside the photo, and play softly, imagining her mother humming along. The melody would often drift into something tender like a lullaby. One winter evening, she received an invitation to perform at a grand international concert, a huge event where the greatest musicians of the world would gather. It was an honor she could have only dreamed of years ago, but instead of excitement, she felt hesitation. She sat for hours looking at the invitation, the golden edges shining under her lamp. She thought of the little children in her neighborhood, of the people she had played for in small rooms, and of the quiet peace she had found in simplicity. The next morning, she called the organizers and thanked them sincerely, but declined the offer. "I think my music belongs somewhere smaller," she said softly. "Somewhere it can touch people, not just entertain them." When she hung up, she felt lighter. For the first time, she realized that success wasn't about the size of the audience. It was about connection, about being part of someone's memory. That spring, she started something new, a free weekend program for anyone who wanted to learn piano, no matter their age or background. She named it The Open Keys. The first class was held in a small community center. Only a handful of people showed up. But as the weeks passed, more came. Children, teenagers, even older people who said they'd always dreamed of playing. She never charged them a single coin. Instead, she asked them to bring stories. "Play what your heart feels," she said, "and tell me why you chose it." The room would fill with laughter and mistakes, but also with courage. Some of her students cried the first time they managed to play a song all the way through. She hugged them, just as her mother once hugged her. The piano became a bridge between strangers, between pain and hope, between silence and expression. Late one night, after everyone had gone home, she sat alone in that room. She looked around at the empty chairs, the scattered sheet music, the soft glow of the streetlight through the window. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The melody was simple, built from memories and gratitude. It carried every sound she had ever loved. The laughter of her students, the applause of strangers, the quiet hum of her mother's voice as she played. She felt something stir inside her, a deep peace, as if the music itself was saying, "You did what you were meant to do." When the last note faded, she whispered, "Thank you," and closed her eyes. The night was still. The piano was silent, but the echo of her music seemed to linger, not just in that room, but in every life she had touched. That was her true stage now, not the grand halls or shining lights, but the hearts of people who had once been afraid to dream, and somewhere, in the quiet rhythm of her own heartbeat, she could still hear her mother's words. "Don't rush the music. Let it breathe," she smiled softly. That was exactly what she had done, all her life. Years passed quietly. The seasons changed one after another, and her little music school became a place known for warmth rather than fame. People from different walks of life came there, not because they wanted to be stars, but because they wanted to feel something again. Her students often said the school didn't feel like a classroom, but like home. The walls were filled with laughter, music, and stories. Old photographs of past performances hung near the piano, and the shelves were full of music books with worn corners. The place smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. She loved walking into that room every morning. The sunlight would fall across the keys, and she'd always start the day by playing a short melody. Not for practice, but as a way of saying hello to the world. She didn't count the years anymore. She just lived them, one note at a time. Her hands had become slower, but her touch on the piano was gentler than ever. The sound carried a kind of peace that only time could teach. Her students often sat quietly when she played, not daring to interrupt. Some of them said that her music felt like a story without words, one that spoke straight to the heart. One afternoon, a girl from her class stayed behind after everyone left. She was new, shy, quiet, always keeping to herself. The girl stood by the door, clutching her notebook. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "Of course," the woman smiled. The girl hesitated. "I want to play in the school concert next month, but people say I'm not ready. They laugh at me sometimes." The woman looked at her for a long moment, then gently said, "Do you know what they said about me once?" The girl shook her head. "They laughed too. They whispered, they doubted. But I played anyway, not to prove them wrong, just to be true to what I loved." The girl's eyes widened a little. "Were you scared?" "Terrified," the woman said with a soft laugh. "But courage doesn't mean you don't feel fear. It means you play through it." The girl smiled shyly. "Then I'll try." "Good," the woman said. "And remember, don't rush the music. Let it breathe." That same night when she was alone, the woman thought about that conversation. It reminded her of her younger self. The trembling hands, the stage lights, the mocking laughter, and the moment her fingers finally found courage through sound. It felt like a lifetime ago. She sat at her piano and began to play the same song she had played that day, the one that changed everything. The notes filled the quiet room, floating softly through the open window into the night. Halfway through, she stopped playing and looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, but one shone brighter than the rest. She smiled, whispering, "Still listening, aren't you?" As years went by, her students grew up and moved on to their own paths. Some became teachers, some musicians, some simply carried music as a part of who they were. Many of them still came to visit her, bringing flowers or stories about their lives. She listened to them with the same patience she always had, proud but humble. One day, the city announced a special award for her contributions to music and education. They wanted to honor her at a grand ceremony for inspiring generations. She didn't like big events anymore, but her students insisted she go. When the evening came, she wore a simple blue dress, the same one she had worn years ago at her charity concert. As she walked onto the stage, the audience stood up to applaud her. It was overwhelming. A sea of faces, lights, and clapping hands. She didn't say much. She just thanked everyone and smiled. But before stepping down, she added quietly, "If I've taught you anything, I hope it's this. Music isn't what you play. It's what you feel, and what you make others feel." The crowd went silent for a moment, then clapped even louder. Many of her old students in the audience were crying. That night she went home holding the small trophy in her hands. It sparkled under the streetlights, but to her it wasn't the award that mattered. It was the love behind it. She placed it beside her piano and whispered, "You've carried me a long way, old friend." In the following months she continued her work as usual. But she grew more thoughtful, often sitting by the window for hours, watching children play outside or listening to the sound of rain tapping against the glass. She began writing down her memories, not for a book, just for herself. Short notes about lessons, faces, and moments she didn't want to forget. Her favorite part of every week was still the Sunday class. All her students gathered in the small hall, their laughter echoing through the room. They'd play simple songs together, clapping and smiling when someone made a mistake. It was during one of these Sunday classes that she noticed her hands trembling slightly. The students didn't see it, but she did. She paused for a moment, smiled faintly, and continued playing. The tremor didn't stop her. It was just another rhythm her body had learned. When the class ended, she stayed behind again. She touched the piano gently, running her fingers across the keys. "You and I," she whispered. "We've been through everything together." That evening, she took a walk through the neighborhood. The air smelled of jasmine, and the sky was painted orange by the setting sun. As she passed by a nearby park, she saw one of her young students playing a small keyboard while other children sang around her. The sound was clumsy but full of joy. She stopped for a while just to listen. Her heart swelled with pride. When the girl noticed her and waved, she smiled and waved back, saying nothing. Sometimes silence was enough. Weeks later, she decided to hold one last concert, not in a grand hall, but right there in her small music room. She called it The Circle. She invited her students, both old and new, and told them each to play something that reminded them of their journey. The night of the concert, the room was full. People sat on chairs, the floor, even by the windows. Candlelight flickered softly, and the old piano stood at the center, waiting. Each student took turns playing, some confident, some nervous, but every performance was beautiful in its own way. When her turn came, the audience fell silent. She sat down, smiled at everyone, and said, "I'm not here to impress you. I'm just here to say thank you." She began to play her mother's favorite melody, the same one she used to practice as a child. Her hands moved slowly, lovingly. Every note felt like a memory: laughter, tears, courage, love. As she reached the end, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't fight them this time. She let them fall, smiling through the blur. When the last note faded, the room was completely silent. No one clapped right away. It was as if everyone wanted to hold on to that feeling a little longer. Finally, someone whispered, "Thank you." And then another. And another, until the whole room softly repeated it together. "Thank you." She bowed her head, whispering back, "No, thank you." After the concert, she sat quietly for a long time while everyone left. The candles burned low. The piano keys felt warm under her hands. She didn't feel sad. She felt complete. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Music gave me a voice when I had none. It gave me courage when the world laughed. It gave me peace when silence was all I had left. If my story ends here, I'll end it with a song." She closed the book and smiled. In the days that followed, the little school continued to hum with music and laughter. Her students carried on teaching others, passing down her lessons, her kindness, her patience. The piano stayed in its place by the window, where sunlight still fell across its keys. Whenever someone new entered that room, they would pause for a moment, as if they could still hear her gentle playing in the air. Some said they could almost feel her presence when they touched the piano. Maybe it was imagination, or maybe it was something more. But everyone who ever heard her play agreed on one thing. She had changed the way they listened, not just to music, but to life. Her story became a quiet legend in the city. The woman who turned laughter into tears, who taught the world that even when people doubt you, beauty can still bloom in silence, and somewhere, in that stillness between one note and the next, her music kept breathing, soft, eternal, and full of love.